revving up. Give it a second.
And if everyone could be muted.
Yes. Okay, we're live.
Welcome everyone to this webinar on food sovereignty and farming. My name is Sian and I'm co-facilitating this webinar along with Ellen on behalf of Slí Eile Action for a Planet Beyond Capitalism. So just to introduce the webinar, I'm just going to read a short description of our group, of the event and the topic, and talk a little bit about the format of the event, and then I'm going to hand over to Ellen to facilitate the discussion with the speakers. So Slí Eile is an anti-authoritarian climate action group helping to build an anti-capitalist climate movement on the island of Ireland. We recognize that patriarchy, racism, colonialism, ableism, class hierarchies, and more, as well as environmental exploitation, are built into the current economic system, and that we cannot deal with the climate and biodiversity crises without also dealing with all of these issues. We believe in the power of self-organized communities to create the new world we need. We believe in the possibility of a future where we can all thrive together within the living world. We started this group last year and had hoped to do a direct action climate camp this summer, but it wasn't possible because of COVID. So instead, for now, we're organizing this webinar series, Decolonizing the Planet, Building the World We Want to See, as a form of collective learning for ourselves and for our communities, and as a way of threading together intersectional and climate justice struggles in Ireland and around the world. We're so excited for our third talk and to have these amazing groups with us who we have a lot to learn from about the farming system in Ireland today. So food is central to all of our lives and is one of our most fundamental needs. Yet we all know there are major problems and deep inequalities in our agricultural system, both at home and abroad, from the beginning of the food chain in the field right up to when the food is consumed on our plates. The inequalities and injustices built into the system and the damaging practices within industrial farming have dire consequences on our lives and on the health of the planet. Some believe the food system is broken, while others assert that it is working precisely as it is designed to, as a capitalist food system. The system we have is built on historic and ongoing oppression and exploitation based on class, race, and gender, and of the natural world. It operates to concentrate wealth in the hands of a minority, while externalizing all of the social and environmental costs onto society in a myriad of ways. We can see this in our degraded soils, our poisoned waters, the horrifying declines in insect and animal life and biodiversity loss, the exploitative conditions many face in the food system, the 2 billion people worldwide suffering from food insecurity, despite the fact that we overproduce food to a massive extent. Proponents of industrial agriculture often claim that we need to use these industrial agricultural practices in order to feed the world. But the reality is that under this capitalist food system, we have massive overproduction of food, mountains of food waste, and billions of hungry and undernourished people worldwide. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, the world produces more than 1.5 times enough food to feed everybody on the planet. Just like during the Irish famine, we know that today hunger is still caused by poverty and inequality, not scarcity. The farming system we have today is shaped by the hierarchical and exploitative social relations which exist under capitalism. If we want a true food revolution, it must upend the social relations of patriarchy, racism, and classism in the food system and in society as a whole. Luckily, the food and farming system doesn't have to be this way. All over the world, peasant and small-scale farmers and land workers are engaged in the life-sustaining regenerative practices of agroecology. Tonight, we will discuss how some of these issues affect us here in Ireland and the farmers who are leading the way forward. As Talavera say, agroecology and food sovereignty show us that human beings have the capacity to have a hugely positive impact on their environment and the natural world if they are given the time and space to do so. So just to introduce a little bit the speakers and the groups this evening, we have Sinead Moran. She is a farmer and co-founder of Foodture, which is a grassroots initiative. Their aim is to platform producers in Ireland who farm in regenerative ways and to raise awareness about small-scale organic farming, which works with nature. They have mapped these kinds of farms in Ireland, thus connecting consumers with local, fair food producers. They also have a really informative podcast about these issues, which is essential listening if you want to learn about the farming system in Ireland today. And we've posted that on our social media channels over the last couple of days. Thomas O'Connor is a member of Talavera and a farmer in Camp County Kerry. Talavera are a member-led organisation made up of farmers, growers and land-based workers who are organising for change in our food and agriculture system. They organise for food sovereignty, for a local food system, for an Ireland free of agrochemicals, for access to land for new entrant farmers, and much more. They want to see a thriving rural landscape where farmers and communities work together to nurture the land for the future and where nutritious food is accessible to all. They are already building this new system in their daily practices. They are members of La Via Campesina, an international peasant herder and fisher folk movement with 200 million members. And then lastly, I'd like to introduce Sean McCabe. He is a researcher with Task, who writes on issues in our agricultural system, climate change, and a just transition in the agricultural sector. He believes that farmers and their communities must play a central role in planning climate action to ensure it is good for farmers as well as for the planet. Last year, he spent a few weeks driving around Ireland, speaking to farmers and land workers about the current agricultural system, climate change, and just transition, and what they think about these issues. He wanted to meet with farmers and their communities to listen to their aspirations for the future of their work and their communities. And then just to give you just a brief explanation of the format of the event. So we're going to ask each speaker 3 questions overall. Each speaker will take a turn answering a question for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next speaker who will answer 1 question, and so on. So we're going to have to keep to the timings to get through everything. So we're going to be giving our speakers a 1-minute warning just in the background. And so we do keep to the 5 minutes for each question. And then we're going to have 15 minutes of audience questions that you can send to us through the YouTube live stream, through the comment section. So for people watching on YouTube, yeah, please write your questions in the comment section and we'll get to them. We may not get to all of them just because of a lack of time. And we'd ask you, please, if you could write your questions in there before 5 to 9, just so that gives us time to filter through them and send those on to the facilitators. And thank you to those who are moderating the YouTube. Lastly, we're not going to accept any offensive comments on YouTube, and those comments will be deleted. And finally, we also have a song from Magnus before we close the discussion. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Sinead now to facilitate the discussion with the speakers. Sorry, to Ellen. Sorry, Ellen.
Thanks, Sian. Okay, so just before we get into the questions, I want to qualify that this is one part of the conversation we're going to be having about the food system. This looks more at it from the farming system side, while in a few weeks we're going to have another discussion that will look at it from a food and land justice and access angle. Also, my questions are a bit long, so yeah, sorry, but I'm trying to give context with them because it's such a big topic. So to start with Sinead, Sinead, your project Future is a really great resource for people wanting to learn about the farming system in Ireland, both the consequences of the current dominant model that we have and the already existing alternatives being practiced here. Could you give us a brief overview of the issues within the agricultural sector here and their environmental and social impacts? Who does the current system work for and who does it harm?
Okay. It's such a broad question, and I'm kind of struggling to kind of think, how am I going to get so much in 5 minutes? So I thought I'm just going to focus in on a couple of things. Probably the first one, I think, when you think of the question of, you know, who does the current kind of agricultural system that we have in Ireland, who does it work for? And I think probably one of the first point of calls to look at would really be farm incomes and farm sizes. Like in 2010, we had 139,000 farms. By 2016, it's 137. So we're beginning to see this decline of farms. We also have, of all those farms in Ireland, only 32% are actually classified as full-time farmers. So the average income of that 32% that would be seen as full-time farmers is somewhere around 51,000. Most of them would be dairy farmers, and at the same time, the top 9 executives of Dairygold in 2016 were earning over 300,000 each. So I think the incomes themselves are a great way to kind of look at who is really benefiting financially from these things. The rest of the farmers in Ireland would be deemed as part-time. Most of them are gaining an income of anywhere between 8,000 to 16,000 off farming. So basically where we stand right now in Irish agriculture is over half of all of our farmers are actually earning income off farm. So farming doesn't even pay, and yet they're still having to farm and produce food. Of course, the question is what kind of food they're producing and who for. At the same time in all of this, that we're seeing this decline in farms, we're seeing that the value of exports has gone up. 2018 is a great year to kind of compare that. In 2018, we saw the value of dairy exports grow by 18%. And the same year, the farm incomes dropped about 31%. So the value of our exports is going up, and yet incomes are going down. And most of that crisis in incomes was laid at the blame of the fodder crisis in 2018. And the fodder crisis was kind of a direct result of basically a classic kind of crisis, I think, of capitalism in general, but definitely in agriculture, is that we kind of are constantly running to such fine margins, and we're constantly pushing for economies of scale that there's no resilience built in the system. And in 2018, we had the heat wave during the summer, and we saw where farms were basically struggling to feed stock. So this was the fodder crisis. And I suppose then that brings me to kind of the impacts of Irish agriculture. I'm sure a lot of people on the call already know that our agriculture, our emissions are dominated by agriculture, over 32%. On top of that, we have issues with water quality. In the 1980s, we had over 500 waterways that were deemed pristine. By 2019, that's down to 20. And then we have biodiversity. The biodiversity crisis, again, which is a worldwide phenomenon, but also an issue for Ireland. We see the decline of species, particularly birds. We have the snipe, the lapwing, the curlew, and these things are directly linked with the intensification of our agriculture. Then we have the pearl mussel, and then we have lots of other things that we don't even know. So in regards to kind of where we sit with Irish agriculture, on paper, Irish agriculture is a booming industry, but it is not really an industry that is working for farmers on the ground. And we see that kind of playing out in the last couple of years with multiple crises, from fodder crisis to beef protests over prices. And the thing about it is that we're getting a real kind of fractured movement on the ground, I think, among farmers, and tensions are high. So you kind of get this thing of farmer, you know, if anyone questions anything, it's a farmer against farmer. And it's a classic kind of thing that we see, I think, with the way our current world is organized, whether it's energy or agriculture, or it's, you know, inequality. These kind of, our system is really geared to this kind of economies of scale, which in agriculture is just not working on the ground. So as I said, you can kind of delve into these topics a lot more on Futura and through other websites. There's other great websites like ARC 2020 and things like that will bring it in on a European perspective. But for definite, we kind of at a stage now in Irish agriculture where we are heading down the line of bigger farms, less farmers.
Great, thanks. That was a very good overview. I know that was a very difficult thing to do in 5 minutes, but I think that was very clear. So thank you. We'll move on to Thomas now. So Thomas, you're a farmer in County Kerry using organic farming practices, and your work has been recognized for its benefits to biodiversity, like you're a Farming for Nature ambassador. Could you tell us a bit generally about these kinds of farming methods, which could be said to fall under like agroecology, regenerative agriculture, and how they can provide an alternative to the current dominant farming model in Ireland? Do you think these methods are a viable way forward for farmers here? You're muted there, Thomas.
Sorted?
We can hear you, but we can't see you. Oh, now you're good.
Okay, there we go. All right, yeah, I'll give you a bit of a background to ourselves. We started farming organically about 12 years ago. We took over an organic store in Tralee and we bought a farm out in Glonagalt in Camp. I was originally a publican, so we sold the pub. My wife was a computer programmer and a plastics engineer. We started learning an awful lot about our food and food production, and we got very worried about the quality of the food first that we were eating and our own health. And then as we learned more about the food system itself, we realized that, Jesus, it was scary. I was told once that whose food you eat, their slave you are. And honest to God, if you knew the kind of people that were in charge of our food system, then you'd be very scared. So knowing all that, when we decided to take over the farm, there was nothing else only to be certified organic. Because as we looked into it, organic was very basic in our minds. It was a quality assurance mark, a legally defined one, the only legally defined quality assurance mark around food production. Essentially meant that there was no chemical inputs, no insecticides, no herbicides, no fungicides, none of the sides that kill people. There was things like looking at rotations, at animal welfare, looking at the farmer as being part of integrated into the system. And again, that nature played a very big part in that. So like we became certified organic. We turned around and between myself and my wife, Claire, we spent about 9 years on the board of IAFCA, now the IOA. And through that, we were interacting with the Department of Agriculture and all the other state bodies and with Teagasc. And again, that also frightened us, the fact that these people that are leading our agricultural system, they had no deep understanding of A, what organic farming was, but also like no comprehension of biological or ecological farming systems. So like I was saying, we have an organic store, and the idea for us is when we deal with third-party customers that don't know us directly, there is a legally defined quality assurance market they can depend on, and then that's worldwide. Now, you don't have to be certified organic to be grown biologically or ecologically. And if you're growing local food produce and you have a close connection to your customers, again, you don't need to be certified. We became certified because, again, minimum quality assurance, it was a political statement for us. It's a ridiculous notion in our mindset that we have to be paid. We have to pay to be certified to grow food that's not polluted, whereas industrial conventional agriculture is. And it's important to remember that the organic system and organic food production and the standards, they all came out of the start of industrial agriculture back in the 30s and 40s, when people noticed the degeneration in the quality of soil and the quality of food and animals that were coming off of the land. And because of that, then they had to establish a new set of legally defined standards. But again, you don't have to be organic in order to grow naturally or to grow according to nature. So can it provide hope for the future and an alternative to the current systems? It can, of course, because organic farming it's more labor intensive. There's no chemicals you use. And when you don't use chemicals, you're not interfering with the natural processes of the land. So you need to learn to work more with nature. It's animal-based and centered. So the care of the animals is centered to what we do inside in organics. And again, like I say, it builds a good, solid community. And looking for the way forward is that for farmers, yes, they can convert to organics. In the past, and my experience has been when dealing with Teagasc of the Department of Agriculture or the established agricultural bodies, that when you talk about organics, they just brush you aside. And when we're in an age of climate change and ecological collapse, organic farming is the solution. Organic farming was the solution 30 years ago and 40 years ago and 20 years ago and 10 years ago. It sets out a very basic framework in which people can transition from industrialized agriculture away from it. And the reason we went into organic food is because we started learning about the conventional agricultural system. Essentially, all these insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, they're all born out of an industrialized machine from World War I and World War II. There's a reason there's ides at the end of all of them, is because they kill nature. If we want to move away from that and help with climate change and go back more to nature, we need to start to understand the natural cycle of things. One of the reasons I became a farmer is because I learned that every atom of my body replaces itself every 7 years. And then I realized that actually, if I was to be a proper Kerry man, I needed to be eating the land in Kerry. So when we look at food production and local food production, it's vitally important for our culture in order that we are eating local food that comes from our local environment, because that is what makes up our bodies and connects us to the land and nature. If we're all eating McDonald's or processed foods traveled halfway around the world, we become a monoculture, just like the ryegrass spread all across Ireland. So is organic the future? I think it's definitely a very good future. Absolutely.
Great. Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I think as well, like Sinead had said, there's been a massive reduction in the number of farmers, and we know that regenerative agriculture, organic agroecology is really knowledge intensive instead of capital intensive. So it's something we need more education around and a focus on more organic.
Yeah, and our experience in the past is it's knowledge intensive, which is grand when you have a community that can share the knowledge, because this was something we learned from other people in the past in a larger community. But for the last 30 or 40 years in Ireland, you were told to get big or get out. If you went for any kind of advice from the established system, it was to put out Roundup, it was about put out artificial fertilizers. It was more about how you could support the industrialized agricultural machinery as opposed to how you could be an independent farmer. Because in the past, farmers were independent. They were the primary producers within the community. But now farmers have been swallowed into the factory and they're forced into just producing commodities.
Absolutely.
And that didn't just happen. That happened over a long period of time. Yeah. And it had led farmers bit by bit all the time through legislation, politics, and policy. So this is why we need to step back. And for us, being certified organic was that step. It was about us making a statement that we're certified organic. We refuse to farm with chemicals and industrial inputs.
Great. So we'll move on to a question for Sean then. Again, this is a very long question / statement. So Sean, we know that our food system here and abroad is deeply unequal and in large part is built upon practices that are exploitative, oppressive, both of the workers, the animals, and also of the land. Farming is also one of the least diverse sectors in Ireland in terms of gender, age, race, etc. A study by Tanya Watson in NUIG in 2014 found that men own 90% of farmland in Ireland. Just 5% of farmers were aged less than 35 in 2016. I couldn't find statistics on race in farming here, but in the UK, 98.6% of farmers are white British. So I think we can imagine what that looks like in Ireland. Increasingly, of course, small family farms are being pushed out and land is consolidated into larger blocks for intensive dairy farming, which is further intensifying rural decline and depopulation. On top of that, people who do the work of producing and serving food here and around the world are not the people who benefit from the wealth in the system. Often they're from migrant backgrounds. They might be undocumented, which means they're even more exploitable by the system. Could you tell us a bit more about what this looks like in Ireland and what has your research found on inequalities here?
Sure, thanks, Ellen. I guess maybe just as a bit of background, I came to this from a perspective of climate justice after working on the international level for a period of time. I'm not a farmer, though I did labour on farms for an awful lot of my youth. I came to it primarily out of a concern about lock-in. We're very comfortable with the concept of lock-in in the climate conversation in terms of building new coal-fired power stations or building any fossil fuel infrastructure now. We're very aware that that's a foolish thing to do. But there's also lock-in in the agricultural sense where people like you point to there are being encouraged to expand, farmers are being encouraged to expand, intensify. That's on the back of low commodity prices. So the cheap food policy is driving people to try to eke out a living from true expansion. And that has very negative ramifications, again, as you said there, Ellen, in terms of rural communities and the vibrancy of rural communities, because larger farms mean fewer farmers and fewer people earning money. I think what has changed in my own mindset about it, from traveling around, from meeting people, from really learning from brilliant people who know an awful lot more than I do. And I point maybe to Judith Hitchman here from Urgency, the global CSA network. I remember having a conversation with Judith where she brilliantly tied together the consumer and the producer through this network of rights. And, you know, Task brought out a report 2 years ago that highlighted agriculture as the most unequal sector in the country in terms of income. Now, if you look at that, and Sinead made the point very strongly earlier about the CEOs of the large agribusiness firms, but there's also the CEOs of the supermarkets. And the supermarket is, I think, a very interesting lens to look at all of this through, because on the one side, they're offering produce that is high quality produce as loss leaders on their supermarket shelves to get people in. So that's your milk, your butter, etc. And then on the other side, you have people who are working in maybe very time consuming jobs, maybe have more than one job. They're either time poor or they're cash poor. And they have to resort to these types of supermarkets in order to be able to subsist. And so it's extracting both the efforts of the producers, and it's extracting the time and the earnings of the consumers, this supermarket model. And then it goes back further in that, like, people have to be able to cook, people have to have the space to cook if they want to enjoy fresh produce. And you're wearing a Massey shirt there, Ellen, and obviously it's been a massive issue in terms of direct provision, but it's also across the board in terms of people experiencing poverty don't have the facilities maybe necessarily to be able to cook properly. So it's a whole of society problem. It doesn't rest with the agricultural sector or farmers. And then you know, you alluded to the inequalities globally and how it ties in with the climate issue. Last time I ran the numbers, which is about 4 years ago, the carbon footprint from food waste is roughly equivalent to the carbon footprint of sub-Saharan Africa. So if you know, I think that sums up in terms of the deprivation of food, the deprivation of energy, in terms of energy access, the role of land in sequestering carbon. You know, it's very, very interrelated, and the inequalities across the board cannot be, you know, you cannot address any of these issues without addressing all of them. And I know my time is running short, so I'll just end on this. I think it's very important that we don't, you know, obviously there's very large actors in this who have an awful lot of power, and the power analysis of it is very important. But it's also, I think, important not to polarize the farming community, because there's many very, very good farmers who have been simply told and instructed to strip away bogs and cut away hedgerows and make land more productive, and they've simply followed the guidance of you know, experts, and now they're getting it in the neck on the other side from the climate sort of movement for saying, you know, you're not doing what's right, and that's a very unfair position to be in. So we need dialogue, and we need to have respect at the bottom of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. All really, really great points. And yeah, I think like what you're saying about food poverty in Ireland, there's also kind of a lack of awareness of how deep that runs in Ireland. I think people assume we have, you know, really high food security and everyone can access food if they want it, or cook healthy if they want, but that's completely not the reality of our society. And yeah, we'll hear from you a bit more later about the farmers you have been talking to. So yeah, I think like having these conversations across the agricultural spectrum is really important. We'll jump back to Sinead now for another difficult question. So Sinead, people who, this is something I've had said to me like a few times, people who promote agroecology or organic agricultural practices as essential if we are, you know, to continue living on the planet and to stop destroying it, We're often met with people stating that we cannot feed the world with these methods, that they're not efficient enough to produce enough food for the growing population, that we need GMO seeds to address world hunger or adverse weather conditions, and so on. Of course, these statements lack nuance and understanding of how we got to this situation in the first place of continuously depleting topsoil, degraded waters and ecosystems, mass hunger globally alongside major overproduction of food, which often goes to waste, issues which are clearly caused by a focus on profit above all else and a lack of justice in the system. Could you speak a bit more to this and give us an overview of how you would respond to these claims as someone who has studied a master's on climate change and agriculture and is a farmer who uses these methods?
Yeah, I think my first pet peeve normally when this conversation begins to come up is that what we do, or what the most do, is that we're niche, that we're some kind of special branch of farmers who just do things in our own little patch, and that's fine as long as we stay over there, but that we don't feed the world. And as you started off at the start of your conversation, there's no doubt that our current agri-food system definitely, you know, globally, we do feed the world. But when that question is put to me, I always try to kind of change that narrative from feed to nourish. And the question really should be, it's not, you know, how do we feed the world and we have to do it this way to feed the world. The question really should be that we need to nourish, you know, we need to nourish the world, because right now we can definitely feed, but we definitely don't nourish people, place and planet. And I think that's pretty obvious when you get down to the nitty gritties of it. Like, you know, you look at the fact that 1/3 of all the food produced in the world is wasted. Most of that waste in the more developed countries like ourselves is at home. And then in other places, it's an issue of kind of getting it to market. But right now in our world, we have 800 million people. The figure is that it's 800 million people that are hungry. And this is deemed as a kind of good figure because we see that it's kind of going in decline. But on the flip side of this idea of feed versus nourish, we actually have over 1 billion people who are suffering from micronutrient deficiencies. And we have 2.1 billion people who are overweight or obese. So we now actually have a world and a food system that definitely feeds, but it doesn't nourish, because 2.5 times more people are overweight than they are undernourished in our global world. So then, nourishing kind of place. You look at rural life in decline, has already been mentioned. You know, in the Irish context, only less than 5% of farmers are 35 years of age, which will brings us to the next question of, you know, if we're going to feed the world, who is going to feed the world? Because if only 5% of our farmers are youth, then who's going to feed them and where are they going to feed them? And then on top of that, it's the idea of feed over nourish. You look at soil, you know, we have where the FAO has gone and declared that we have less than 60 harvests left. And that's again because we have focused in on feeding instead of nourishing people in place. And then I suppose the next part of that would be planet. We have a food system, yes, it feeds, but again, it's only as strong as its weakest link. And we've seen with things like the Beast from the East a few years ago and COVID, whenever there is a slight interruption to the long food supply chain, that, you know, any kind of breakage along that chain and the system collapsing, it takes it a while to kind of try and reorganize itself. And that's because it's not resilient. And unfortunately, we can't feed a world under a changing climate in a non-resilient system. It's efficient, but it's not resilient. And again, that's coming back to this idea again of feeding versus nourishing. So that's always, I think that's always the one thing that's always brought up every time you try to have a conversation about how we farm, and it does come to this, oh, we have to feed the world and it's better that we do this. But it's not about feeding, it's about nourishing. And I think that's the best way to kind of change that narrative a little bit and ask those questions, because the figures don't stand, you know. It shows that we do feed, but we definitely don't nourish.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I also okay, what was I going to say? I just totally forgot. Yeah, I think it also just erases like all the farmers around the world who are in the global south and who do feed their communities and use these agroecological methods and have seeds that they've saved over countless generations that are adapted to where they live and are much better for feeding their communities than, you know, Monsanto seeds would be.
This is it. Like at the end of the day, like one of the biggest issues when it comes to food and food poverty is often access, and whether that's a lack of means, financial means, or access to food, or direct access to food. Like, you know, when I moved back to Mayo, one of the first things that stuck out in my mind is my best, the other half of Future, Natalie, was based in Smithfield in Dublin, and she was a part of a CSA, which is a community supported agriculture. And she was getting food direct off the farm, and I was in Mayo surrounded by farms and getting food from Aldi, because that was my nearest point for food. So you kind of have to go, okay, you know, we are, again, it's this the idea of feeding the world, but we're not nourishing in any sense of for whether that's below the ground or above the ground. We're not doing that. And I think that's really, it's like the conversation about how we farm and, you know, the issues in Irish agriculture. And as we mentioned, so many farmers have been encouraged, pushed, and incentivized down one particular path. And we have an opportunity, I think, to do that down another path by changing that narrative from those words, from feed to nourish.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just something that stuck out to me, I was reading a book the other day and they quoted Vandana Shiva talking about how in India 40,000 children go blind every year because of a lack of vitamin A, and at the same time herbicides contribute to this by destroying the freely available sources of vitamin A, which is the weed Batua, which is a crop that is, you know, not commercially useful to capital because it grows really abundantly and freely, so it has to be destroyed. But it's actually more nutritious than a lot of crops that will be grown on a commercial scale. So it's just like the system isn't, as you're saying about nourishing people, it's about turning a profit for big companies. So
it's two different perspectives. It's that feed to nourish. You know, if you're looking at taking a piece of land and what can I grow or produce on this piece of ground, like I can just only speak in our own experience. They were running about 40 acres. We could probably, if we were non-organic, if we were relying on external inputs to basically run beyond the limits of our farm, we would probably be able to run anywhere between 25 to 30 cows, depending on those cows, and produce a load of milk and send it off to a co-op. And that's fine, but we're neither paying ourselves nor the ground that we're working on. And really, who are we feeding? Like when you look at milk figures from a couple of years ago, I think there was 850 million litres of milk, but only about 500,000 litres of it is actually used as liquid milk. Most of it is powdered down here in Ireland and exported. So again, who are we feeding? You know, and it's just language is very powerful, and how we frame things and the words that we use can be really powerful. And I think anytime that question of how we feed the world, it's not about how we feed the world, it's how we nourish it.
Absolutely. So jumping back to Thomas, can you tell us a bit about Talamh Bio, the grassroots land workers organization you're a part of? Talamh Bio is a proponent of food sovereignty. What does this mean? And you're also members of Livia Campesina, an international peasant herder fisherfolk movement with 200 million members. So why was it important to be part of an international movement? And I want to say, obviously, as well, Sinead is also part of Talamh Bio, but
yeah, we have a great team in Talamh Bio. Talamh Bio means the living land, and the focus is to work with land, people, and community, because you can't have one without the other. You need to connect land, people, and community together if we want sustainable agriculture. Talamh Bio is a grassroots organisation of farmers, growers, and land-based workers, all on the island of Ireland, so the whole island of Ireland. And our aim is to ensure a living landscape where people and ecosystems can live together. Our vision is we want to create a better food system in Ireland where all people have access to healthy, nutritious, quality, and affordable food, which is extremely important. We want to help farmers farm in a way which benefits and restores natural ecosystems while building our soils. And leaving the land better than when we started. It's a new approach, not about kind of farming, which is exploitative, colonial, capitalist, and takes from the land, but how we can make a living from the land and leave it better for next generations. We want to show solidarity with rural communities across Ireland and also across the world, because we were talking about how do you feed the world? The way to feed the world is by being able to feed our own communities, and then we're not taking food from people elsewhere in the world. That's shipped at huge transport costs, huge environmental costs, all because middlemen can make a profit on it. So Talavera is about relocalizing our food system and transitioning away from heavy input dependent, oil dependent, chemical dependent. And if you take away those inputs and costs, well, then you're looking at a farm system that can be profitable, not necessarily with huge turnover. So if you can remove the inputs, the huge cost of inputs, then you can turn around and make farms more sustainable, which is what we need to do. We want to create a thriving landscape where farmers and citizens can work together to nurture the land for the future, as I said. But we really want to engage in political and legislation systems where we can get support for small-scale agriculture. Because in the past, essentially, if we get 15% of what we give to our agricultural budget to local food production and local food systems, then we could easily feed Ireland. But instead, we're dependent on all these imports all the time. And you see when there's a crisis, what happens? People are rushing for white pans off of the supermarkets, you know? So it's very important to rebuild our local food systems because they have been degraded over the years. And because of the industrialized food system, it's been pushed more and more into the commodity basis. And it's very hard to make a living out of agriculture simply because food is very cheap, but it's not cheap. All the costs are hidden. The costs are hidden in subsidies and background and taxes and supermarkets, all this kind of stuff. So farmers are getting paid a very, very, very small percentage of what is being made off it. Like Christine Jones, she's a soil specialist in New Zealand, and she has figures from New Zealand and Australia, which would relate to Ireland. They show nearly 95% of all money, profits, turnover from agri-food systems go to external shareholders as external systems as opposed to directly to the farmer. If we want a better food system in Ireland, we need to turn around and be helping and support our farmers. So Talavera focuses on things like agroforestry, living soils, local food, regenerative farming, agroforestry, biodiversity, and food sovereignty. But essentially what we're trying to do is build a community of like-minded people that see the issues we have with our existing agricultural system, that know there are solutions, because honest to God, there are no shortage of solutions to solving the problems. It's only the will and intent to do it. And while the problems themselves might seem hugely complex, and they are, because my God, they're coming from every angle that at you, but the solution is simple. We need to refocus on community. We need to refocus on nature and the natural world. And our agricultural system at the moment, unfortunately, does the absolute opposite. It degrades the quality of life for farmers. It degrades the farming land itself. It's essentially colonial and capitalism. It's about exploitation, taking what you can and running away. And so we want to build a better food system, one that improves the environment that we live in, that meets the challenges of climate change and ecological decline, and improves the ability of future generations to make a living from the land. And again, protects the well-being. Like a good part of our mental wellness is connected with nature. There's nature deficit disorder because most people live in towns and cities and they don't experience the natural world anymore. And farming is very important for that. So if you take people out of the natural environment, they can't have respect for it. If people can't eat local, culturally appropriate food, well, then they can turn around and have a better understanding. Food sovereignty is that. It's about local quality food. It's about being independent. And then we're part of El Campesino. And the Campesina it's the same movement, except it's worldwide. There's millions of peasant farmers, and the issues we face here in Ireland with food security, with food sovereignty, not food security, because the food security is what the word they want to use now. It means that you can be provided with the minimum amount of calories to keep you alive. But if those calories are inappropriate because they're not nutrient dense, or they're not appropriate because they're not culturally from your own environment, or they're not foods that are connected with your past, well, then it's no good. Which is why we need to talk about food sovereignty rather than food security. Food security feeds directly into the industrial food system, because we can have food security by importing everything from around the world to us. But there's no resilience or sustainability in that, because if there's an issue with oil, or if that entire delicate food system and chain collapses, well, then people are on the back foot. We have a country that, sorry.
No, that's a great overview. We're obviously on a time limit and I want to hear everyone talk for hours, but unfortunately we don't have.
Join Talavera. It's a very good way to start.
Yeah, and people should sign up as supporter members. We'll share the link later where people can see how they can sign up and support Talavera, or if they're growers, get more involved. To jump back to Sean again, so talking about climate change and agriculture is always quite contentious in Ireland. Like, we've seen these debates over the last few years. So even though we were until quite recently a predominantly agricultural society, we now seem to have a general lack of understanding of how the farming system works here and a lack of connection to nature. Last year, you spent time going around the country meeting farmers to discuss all of these kinds of issues and talking about the future of climate change and work in rural communities. Of course, we know climate disruption will impact hardest on those who work the land, yet they're often left out of these conversations. So can you tell us what you found when talking to farmers who came from all across the agricultural spectrum?
Sure, Ellen, thanks. I guess what I found was remarkable. You know, it kind of comes back to what Thomas has just said there. The knowledge exists. I think sometimes, like my previous point, that it's set as a contentious us against them issue in Ireland, because it's not. I think most farmers are very aware of the impacts. Sinead mentioned earlier the fodder crisis in 2018. We were lucky to avoid another one this year, and it may yet come. But you know, the impacts of climate change, we know from the IPCC, will impact fisheries and farming first and hardest. I think if we were to look at it truly, there's a phenomenal film called Thank You for the Rain, which is set in Kenya, a documentary about a farmer in Kenya. And I'd highly recommend watching that, because it would shake you in terms of the impacts of climate. And Kasulu, the farmer in that documentary, is a canary in the coal mine for what is coming our way as well. It was a real pleasure to travel around the country. It was a gift, actually, to meet so many phenomenal people who, you know, are facing challenging times. So just to touch on some of the points, the intensification comes with an increase in individual debt as people build the infrastructure on farm. It comes with an increased cost of inputs, as Sinead was mentioning earlier. Margins are narrow, and that then comes with incredible mental stress and strain, and so this is the system that we have currently. I think it's a large part of it, and it needs to be addressed. But then on the other side, you know, I was fortunate enough to meet Thomas's wife Claire in their shop in Kerry. Sinead, I used FoodSure to identify all the farms I would stop off in. And there were some remarkable, I suppose, stories of transformation. One in particular, I won't mention the farmer's name because I'm not sure he'd want me to, but he had been in a situation where he had taken out 600,000 to increase a loan of 600,000 to increase his herd to about 100 cattle, 100 cows. And then he was increasing it again to a further 180, I think, with another 500,000 euro loan. And his first child was born. This was about 2017. And he took the Chagas spreadsheet that he had on inputs, etc., and started to eliminate some of the key inputs, and he found that his margins could be drastically improved if he changed the way he farmed, and has gone from that intensification treadmill, as he'd call it, to reversing the entire trust of his farm. He's back down to about 40 head herd. He has a CSA farm operating, has more time, is making much the same in terms of income. And so it does come back to points that have already been made about, you know, who is this process of intensification serving most? And then when we link it to climate and when we understand that this is coming at an unbelievable rate, I don't think we have any comprehension of how close we are to falling off the edge in terms of climate. And sometimes I genuinely feel it's too late. But there's another point that's been brought up, and a minute here, so I'll wrap up. There's one point that's been brought up by Thomas about community, and it's very, very important that if we're to do this successfully, we have to build community as we do it, and we have to ensure that the wealth that exists stays within our communities and isn't extracted. And that's how we can improve people's quality of life, because the big challenge with acting on climate change is that we have to act in such a way that people see their lives get better. If people's lives get worse, they'll resist changes, and that resisting of change will squander the time we have left to take action. So the work that we're doing with Task, and which is informed by all of these conversations with really brilliant farmers and fishermen and others across the country, is looking at how we can harness the production that's happening in Ireland, make sure that it's localized through local economies, and where possible, give farmers back the means of production, essentially. You know, the greatest shame, I think, if you speak to farmers around the country, is the loss of cooperatively owned local abattoirs and local creameries, because they all employed a large number of people, they kept people in the community, and they gave farmers a greater price for their produce. And that is something that really we have to figure out how to bring back in a meaningful way.
Great. It's all really, really interesting points. I'm going to move on to our last question before we go into the questions from the YouTube. So if people are watching on YouTube, make sure you put your comments in there soon so that we can get them here on the Zoom. So yeah, another very long question. It's the same question for everyone, so we'll go in the same order, starting with Sinead first. But for us in Sliabh Ella, creating a radical climate movement and a better collective future for all is about challenging all systems of oppression, including capitalism, racism, patriarchy, and so on. The farming system and how we interact with the land is also of central importance, of course, in creating this better future for all of us and for the planet. In fact, depending on your perspective, some people believe it forms the basis of everything else that we can do, and it's something we would all benefit from participating in. Malcolm X said, revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. For you, what would a just farming or land-based future look like in Ireland? And what do we need to do to go about creating this system that would work well for nature, for land workers, and for all of us who need to eat every day? So very difficult question that you only have a few minutes to answer. But yeah, what would your vision of the land-based future look like in Ireland? So Sinead.
I was again kind of thinking, how am I going to get this in 5 minutes without waffling or going completely off topic. So I kind of went back to Future's website, and I went looking in again at, you know, it took us ages to write our about us in one page. And I think that just brought me to the thing that, you know, what is a just farm future? We always use the term fair food and a fair food future, which is where the name Future comes from. But we kind of came up with a definition, and we use it, and kind of this is the idea behind it, which is that fair food fulfills our need for nutritious, ethical, affordable food without compromising the health of our planet or the livelihood of farmers, ensuring that future generations will be able to feed themselves in the same way. So it's this idea that we have a food system that is nourishing people, place, and planet, but is also providing a sustainable livelihood for farmers so that they can remain on the land now and that generations after them can also go on the land. And that within that, people can afford food, because as we know, access to food is one of the biggest issues. I think we could talk loads about kind of the ideal food system that we want and whether that's local or, you know, there's lots of different terms that we can use. And I think everyone who is half engaged with this topic kind of has an idea of what they would like. But I think really what we need to be talking about is, and you have it in your question, is how do we get there? And I think we really need to have a conversation about a just transition in agriculture. You know, we do use it a lot in climate change and we talk about a just transition. And I think we do need to talk about a just transition in farming, because, you know, farmers didn't just all wake up one day and start farming one particular way, or a way that intensified, and they didn't decide to go, do you know what, I'm going to specialize, I'm going to completely overhaul, and I'm going to go into massive debt and go into dairy. They just didn't decide that. This was a progression over the last few decades that to, you know, kind of where we are today. And I think that it's not, sometimes the conversation in how do we have a better, fair food future is kind of, oh, we need to replace this system with that system, but we need a transition to get from this system to that system. And we need different supports along the way, from financial to knowledge. And I think that then brings us, and the word has been mentioned loads, to community. So I think as consumers, and I really hate that word, I think the first point to call for those of us who don't farm is to actually stop thinking of ourselves as direct consumers and relying on kind of information through supermarkets or through labels for our food. And I think we need to reconnect and regard ourselves as active food citizens. And we have a role to play within that transition to a fairer food future. And I always think Wendell Berry said it best when he said, eaters must understand that eating takes place inescapably in the world that is inescapably an agricultural act, and that how we eat determines to a considerable extent how the world is used. And that is pretty much, you are what you eat, or, you know, to eat is an agricultural act. And we can, yes, we have consumer choice to pick this product over that product, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about reconnecting with food and reconnecting with who produced your food and how was that food produced, and reconnecting in a way that is building community, because there is a level of transparency that no label will ever be able to give you when you know who produced your food and how they produced it. And when you know, we can use food as an opportunity to help us to build this community with kind of across from an urban rural base, and to kind of reconnect and help kind of transition to that kind of new future where, again, we are able to produce food in not a sustainable way, but in a fair way to people, place, and planet, and in a nourishing way.
Great. Beautiful vision for the future. I love Wendell Berry. He's so great. Thomas, do you need me to repeat the question, or are you okay to jump in there?
Yeah, I'm okay to jump in. The first part is what would a just farming system in Ireland look like? I suppose we come back to livelihoods. People should be able to make a decent living out of working their farms, and they should get paid a fair price for what they produce, and it shouldn't be a commodity or a percentage that they sell on to somebody else. It'd be a system in which the whole community is educated about the quality of their food, right from the farmer and the influence they have on the environment, but then also to, I hate the word consumer, but yes, the consumer, the person at the end. So a consumer walks into a supermarket and they see a sign and it says O'Hara's bread or O'Mary's bread, or it looks local, it sounds local, but unless you look at the back of the package and you engage as a consumer, there's a huge amount of marketing and money that goes into deluding the consumer. So an ideal system is where we can take all that out of it. And what you see in front of you is either local, or it's either Irish, or it's either organic, or it's either nutritionally dense. Not that you flip it over and there's 1,000 different ingredients in the back of it. So what you have is like a monoculture food that everybody is eating. But we need farmers and communities who should be at the center of decision making, at the center of policy and legislation. We need to push our politicians because, well, they honestly don't know. And we're lucky because we're at a time now where farmers and community are more educated than the legislators and the politicians, because we've access to knowledge and technology and information that wasn't there in the past generation. So it can be very easy to turn around and to give out about the past generation and why they went into the particular type of farming and why they let it happen. The information they had came from 3 or 4 sources, and all those 3 or 4 sources were about getting more money for their friends. It wasn't about making the communities more resilient or sustainable. So we need to turn around and move back from that. We need a system which puts the power back into the hands of farmers and communities and citizens instead of the corporate setups and external profiteering. We need to build a food system that improves the health of the environment in which we live. Because if we have a healthy environment, we have healthy people. The reason we are so sick and the reason we have a coronavirus and all this, there's no problem with a virus. There's thousands of viruses. Only 10% of your body is human DNA. The rest is virus and bacteria. But we've been at war with nature and life since the 1940s, and our agricultural system represents that. So we need to go back to nurturing nature and life. And if we do that, we'll be absolutely amazed at the bounty that can come from it and surplus that we can produce to share with our communities. And that comes back to saving our seeds, that comes back to reducing our inputs, and that comes back to getting a fair price for what we produce. And again, that the people that are eating it are healthier because of it. And again, I think food is extremely important, and the food that comes from the land you live in is extremely important, because in the past we had thousands and thousands of cultures all over the world. Those cultures were born and bred out of the environment they lived in and the food they consumed that made up their body. And that's what created their world. And now we live in a monoculture. Like, it's McDonald's everywhere, it's the same kind of food, it's the same packaged stuff. So we need to step away from that. And we're blessed. In Ireland, we have a lovely green country. It used to be 40 shades of green, now it's 2 shades of ICI green, loads of ryegrass. But we can transition back. You know, we can go with high nature value farming, we can farm from nature, we can be organic and biological, ecological, all those things. Honest to God, I know more now than I ever knew before. Things are far worse than I ever imagined it could be, but I have more hope now than I ever had that we can do something about it. So
that's great. Sean, over to you for that question.
Thanks, Alan. I think the just transition question is a difficult one for farming. I think in general the just transition is a difficult question because people don't really understand it. It's a concept that has emerged from the trade unions, and farming typically in Ireland, if you go back historically, farmers were the enemy of trade unions in many regards, because it was farm laborers who were unionized and the farmer was not in the unions. So we really need a movement of solidarity among farmers. First of all, we need the social dialogue that goes along with the just transition, and really we need to look at rights-based approaches. Now that can sound a bit academic or something, but it's about realizing people's rights through this transformation that we're going through. And I'd go a step further. If you look at Amartya Sen's development as freedom as a model, like, it's about local development, it's about community development, and it's about expanding the capabilities and the opportunities of people in rural communities, whether they're farmers or other people living in rural areas, to be able to enjoy freedoms of high quality life and high standards of living. I honestly think that the way we do that is to trust communities. We have had very top-down policy making in Ireland and in Europe for an awful long time. Maybe the one exception is the LEADER program, which has for a long time supported community-led local development in Ireland, and back in the 90s would have been a very successful model. We have, I suppose, under-resourced it more recently. But looking at models like the LEADER program and combining it with concepts like the Preston model, which is a community wealth building model where anchor institutions, municipal institutions, use their procurement power to funnel money into communities. Now, I was just on a call earlier today, and there was a gentleman from Belgium on there who was talking about a situation in where in Belgium was he? Wallonia. And what had happened there was they had it was predominantly a rural area. You had schools with school meals being provided by multinational companies, and you had local farmers struggling to make ends meet, and they were able to transform that to make sure the school meals were procured from local farms, and you create livelihoods, meaningful livelihoods, and you also make sure that kids are getting to access to nutritious, locally grown food. You know, it strikes me as insane that it costs less to buy carrots grown in Israel than it does to send a postcard from here to Cork. So we have to normalize that system, and but we have to find ways, as Thomas has said there, of making sure people's livelihoods are respected. So the cheap food policies that currently exist need to be examined. We need to make sure that people can access, so it's a capabilities thing, can access the food that's necessary, but we also need to make sure that the livelihoods involved are respected. So that's both sides of producer and, for want of a better word, consumer. And then the final thing I'd say about equity in all of this is that there's no, like, the just transition isn't a side project of the climate action. It is climate action, and unless there is a just transition, we fail at averting the climate crisis. And so linking up, and this is the really good thing about what you guys are doing and what so many people are doing across the country, is creating those networks of people and realizing the potential and the agency that exists within those networks, to chart their own course. And not really, you know, the policy landscape can catch up, I think, in some regards. Like, obviously there's things like the perverse incentives that prevent proper, meaningful agroforestry taking off in Ireland and across Europe. Really, agroforestry has a huge role to play in addressing climate and improving animal welfare, and you know, it's a real transformative system. So there are policy changes that are needed, but you know, the cooperative movement in Ireland didn't happen top down. It happened from communities organizing, and the same can happen again. And I think, you know, on the back of the beef plan issues last year, like, there's an ideological space there to be claimed. My fear would be that if people are not talking to farmers, if those who care about climate justice are not engaging with farmers, talking to them, helping them understand the concepts that you're trying to promote, then the right will claim that space, and we're already seeing that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really scary possibility that we actually have a webinar coming up about the rise of ecofascism as well. But yeah, also just reactionary forces in general. Like, it's totally growing in Ireland, and we need to deal with it. So those were all really interesting answers, and I could just ask questions all day, but that's the end of my question part, and we're going to move on to the public questions. Sian, if you want to go ahead with those. So again, yeah, sorry, it's my fault, we're a bit over time, so hopefully it's okay for people if we might go on like a few minutes longer at the end. And Sian, and I'll keep time a little bit when you're answering the public question, just to keep us on track.
Thanks, Ellen, and thanks a million, Sinead, Thomas and Sean. That was all really, really great. And thanks to everybody who's been commenting and asking questions on the YouTube, and to everybody who's doing work behind the scenes, moderating those. So what I'm actually going to do, we've picked out 3 main questions, and Shliela also wants to add on a little bonus question. So I'm actually going to ask them, the 3 of them now, and then let the speakers, if you just want to jump in there and address all of them or address some of them, or whatever most speaks to you. So there's 2 questions that are focused on climate change and on carbon. One is, what are the agricultural methods that sequester carbon rather than releasing it? And the second one is, the climate debate is often reduced to very simple quantitative metrics, for example, carbon dioxide parts per million. So how much of our current change efforts are thwarted by analytical rather than holistic or connective thinking? So those are the two climate related questions. And then third question is, food policy is designed and led by industry, government and farm bodies, rather than producers, consumers, along with government and farm bodies. How do we get agroecological women's and other voices to the table? And then Shliela would also just, if the speakers, if you would like to just elaborate a little bit on the issue of access to land, that a lot of young people want to farm, but they can't afford access to land for growing food, which is something we will be discussing on our next food webinar, but we just, would like to get your thoughts on it. So I don't know if anybody would like to answer some or most of those questions.
Yeah, I can start if you want.
Okay, thanks, Thomas.
Okay, yeah. When it comes to carbon sequestration and putting carbon back in the soil, well, in building our soil and building our biology and ecology is number one. But the first step before that is we have to stop poisoning the biology and the ecology. Because industrialized agriculture throws in loads of chemicals, it throws loads of fertilizers, but essentially all it is doing is allowing the burn off of carbon. So for millennia, people have farmed, they've taken a surplus off the land, but then all that surplus carbon was put into the soil. As soon as we start plowing, we start cultivating, we start denuding the land, we remove the trees, we take away the diversity in the plants and the flowers, and then we remove animals from the landscape, all of that affects it. The best carbon sequestration systems in the world have always been the prairies, where animals have grazed across them. Like mob grazing is a system that works like that. But essentially planting more trees. We have a schizophrenic approach to trees and farming. Because of Quilcher and forestry policy in Ireland, trees are seen as a dirty thing. But what we need to do is reintegrate those back into our farming systems. When it comes to food policy, well, we need to turn around and be more vocal with the knowledge we have, both to our politicians, and then we need to challenge the Irish interpretation of European law. Like there's the farm to fork, which has great potential. Europe is now demanding 25% of land be organic. Now we have to watch how our Irish government interprets that, because they usually interpret all of those legislation through the lens of industrial agriculture and making more money for that kind of system. So how do we change it? We engage in it. We talk to our politicians, we turn around and then create models outside of that prove it's working. Because I can talk like this because my own experience knows that what we can do. And the people I've met know, through them, I've seen what they can do. Like take NOTS, National Organic Training Networks. NOTS, yeah, NOTS. They do a biological conference every year. And for the last 3 years, it's phenomenal to see the potential. Christine Jones and loads of other people talk about the potential of carbon sequestration through the soil, through ecological and biological farming systems. And this is what we need to refocus on. And when it comes to access to land, well, I was lucky. My father went off to England in the 50s and 60s. He made money over there. He came back to Ireland, he bought a pub. I was able to sell that pub, clear my mortgage, essentially swap it for 25 acres of land. But if it wasn't for that, there's no way on God's earth we'd be able to pay our bills. So it's like I was gifted the land and we had to do everything else afterwards. But just the cost of keeping going, it's phenomenal. So if you have to take on the cost of investment in the first place, it's ridiculous. It puts too many people out. So we need to look at land share possibilities, looking at old farmers that are isolated and try to reconnect them with younger people that are on the land and rebuild the relationships and make sure that the land flow in the future is going to people who want to engage with the land. Because what's happening in the past, it's happening all over the world. It's a massive clearing. It's get big or get out. They're pushing small producers out and it's only a monoculture that's left of big producers and commodity producers. So we need to hold the space.
Brilliant. Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, really, I'm intrigued and delighted to hear talk of land sharing. I don't know, maybe Sinead, would you like to build on some of the things Thomas was saying there?
Yeah, same thing. I was just thinking here in my head, the question on carbon sequestration versus, and holistic thinking and analytic thinking. I think I find sometimes now that I'm like, I grew up on a farm, but I never had much of a role on the farm when I was young. And then, when I finished school, I wanted nothing to do with farming, and I wanted to be anything but a farmer. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago would I be farming, I would have laughed you out the door. But I think what I found was that my kind of entry to this came from that environmental sector, and from that from the need of feeling I wanted to work in something that was changing, that felt like I was taking action on the ground. And I thought policy might be the way. I thought through environmental activism might be the way. And I find that farming is a great way to do stuff on the ground, but that's because I'm very lucky to have access to land. If I didn't have access to land, it would be a whole other ball game. But I think the one thing I have learned in regards to this holistic versus analytic is often there is kind of this idea that farming, if for farming to be progressive, it's very much dictated by a narrative and a hard science, that we talk about the dry matter that we feed our cows and stuff like that, and we can break it down into the tonnage of what she needs and what she doesn't need, and we can break down milk into solids and butter fats and everything else, and we can talk about the amount of protein, what percentage of protein that we're going to feed our cows, etc., etc. And I think in all of that, it is part and parcel of that trend to where we are now, of this intensive system that relies so heavily on external inputs and external knowledge that we have forgotten as farmers. And we maybe not just forgotten, but we don't trust our own knowledge, and we don't trust the knowledge that we can gain from just standing in our field and watching it and learning how the land works and what happens in different ways. Like the amount of times I've stood in a field with the farmer and they'll talk about an area of grass that's not doing great or whatever, and I'll kind of say, oh, where are you, what way is facing south? And they're kind of going, what? Why is that even a question? So yeah, I definitely think that within agriculture at the minute, it is definitely seen as perhaps maybe, and I hate the terms, but hippie or something different, to really take that holistic approach to your land. And when we talk about carbon and different things like that, we can get caught up and kind of going, well, if I plant this, that will take up so much carbon, etc. But really what we need to look at is the cycles of it and how we manage our system. Like farming and working the land is something that changes every day, every hour, and it can be labor intensive and it can be non-labor intensive depending on how you do it. But I think definitely this idea of holistic versus analytic, while there's great things that we can learn in that analytic approach, and you definitely need that, I think we do need to kind of step back and learn to trust our own knowledge and to the amount of knowledge that we can gain from just working on our land and getting to know it,
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, it's about what type of knowledge is valued or holds value under capitalism as well, and knowledge that's accumulated from a connection to the land has been completely devalued. Okay, thank you. Thanks for that, Sinead. Sean, would you like to address any particular one of those questions or just give us some of your thoughts?
Sure, yeah. I guess, Jan, there's a few things maybe to start off with, the methodologies to sequester carbon and holistic thinking, taking both of those together. I think we can have a lot of fun with this because it's actually life's meant to be good crack, and this is all about creative solutions. Sequestering carbon, like silvopasture, has unbelievable potential. It's about 2.7 tons of carbon per hectare per year. We have about 2 million hectares of pasture land in Ireland. If we were to overnight plant silvopasture across all of that pasture land, we'd be at negative 50% emissions. So it's a huge tool. Now, as Thomas rightly points out, we have an issue with trees, and thanks to Quilch's approach, farmers don't think planting trees on land is not a positive outcome for their livelihoods. So we have to obviously transform that, but that can be done. In terms of the holistic approaches, it stretches all across society. Like this is everything. When we look at food and the production of food, it's literally everything. So weird things like a 4-day work week can be considered climate action, because if it gives people the time to shop organically and locally, then it is helping. Things like the right to housing, having that opportunity to cook, looking at you know, what can we do in terms of marketplaces and bringing people closer to the producers, so that there is an understanding of where food is coming from. But then, you know, like there's all other areas of Ireland that are yet to be, like, you know, we lose about 10 megatons per year through of greenhouse gas emissions through cutaway bogs. Now, if we were to start looking at podoculture and the role that podoculture can play in sequestering carbon and creating fodder for animals or construction material, insulation, you know, if we were to say push it further and look at the legalizing of medicinal cannabis and then growing cannabis crops on the bog, which would nurture the soils and sequester a ton of carbon as well, not literally a ton, but a lot. All we have to do is be creative in how we think about these things. Then just to the other question quickly, what was the other question? The final one.
The final question there is how can we get agroecological women's and other voices to the table, like in terms of food policy?
We just have to get people to the table. Like there's an agricultural strategy being developed right now to follow on from Harvest 2025 or whatever it's called. And I know Brenda Dunford from the Burn Life Project is on that task force, but we should be looking at who's on that task force, what's the gender composition of it, what you know, like these things are happening live, and there should be pressure on them and focus on them, and real questions being asked about, well, why were people selected and whose interests are they representing? Because these are the strategies that will determine you know, the next 5 or 10 years. So you know, there's an awful lot that can be done. It's just about realizing our own power and our own agency.
That's great. Thank you very much. And yeah, I would agree that it's important to be, like Thomas said it as well, engaging with policy, or engaging with the kind of skewed interpretation of EU law that we have here in Ireland. But Thomas also said, yeah, creating models outside of those policy frameworks that prove that everything that you've been talking about this evening is working. And yeah, I'd just like to acknowledge all the amazing work that farmers in Talamh Bio and Future and other grassroots organizations are doing in creating that. And we're just going to hand over to Ellen now just to introduce the music.
Great. Yeah, I just had a look at the YouTube chat there, and there's so many really great comments and really interesting points, and I wish we did have time to answer more. Like there was some questions about animal rights and things like that within the agricultural system, and just so much interesting stuff. So I hope these conversations can take place, can continue obviously, and there'll be more opportunities to discuss all that. We're going to have a song from Magnus and Ben. If you're still there, you've been hiding for the whole thing.
Yeah, we're here, but the house we're in had its electricity cut, so we're currently without power. So that's why the light is a little weird.
It's very atmospheric.
Yeah, it's really appropriate, I suppose. I'm glad we're playing acoustic instruments. We're not going to be singing in the strictest sense of the word. We're actually going to play tunes instead. But yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Magnus. This is Ben.
Oh, yeah.
Hope that sounded okay, thanks.
Oh, brilliant. That was great. Sounded perfect for me. Thanks so much. That's also something that like we need to bring back to farming. Like obviously in the past when they used to do meholds and share collective farming tasks, I think at the end they used to have a Kaylee and have music and like
Oh, for sure.
it's essential for the future food system we're creating. So thank you. That was lovely. If it's okay, I'm just gonna keep people for another like 5 minutes just to close off the discussion, if that's okay. So yeah, hopefully people have time for that. I just want to say thanks so much to everyone for speaking. You all have really interesting perspectives that are really valuable and important for us to hear, and I know you all are giving up your time to speak with us. So yeah, I'm very grateful, and obviously to Magnus and Ben, that was really great. And we're being helped by a bunch of people in the background in Shliela as well, who are doing loads of work for this. So thanks to them. Just to close, I think obviously the food system and the farming system is incredibly complex, and we barely scratched the surface with this short webinar, but I hope it gave people watching a good overview of the system here. I think it's clear to all of us that the dominant capitalist food system we have is driving us off a cliff in terms of climate change, as well as being deeply exploitative. It's not meeting our needs while it's actively undermining the living world. Luckily, there are other options, as we've seen, which can be life-sustaining, just, regenerative and healing for both us and the planet, namely the movement that is food sovereignty and agroecology. The food system affects all of us, and I'm sure after hearing the speakers tonight, many people are wondering how they can engage more with it, which a few of the speakers mentioned different things you can do, but I just want to stress that, of course, for those who can afford it, please buy organic where possible, buy from local growers. You can join a community supported agriculture box scheme if there's one near you. Join a community garden, grow some of your own, even if it's some herbs on a windowsill, because there's really nothing like sowing seeds and watching them germinate and grow. If we want this type of farming to grow in Ireland, then we do need to support it. I'm also going to share a document later with some information on educational opportunities that exist in Ireland around organic growing, because we really need more young people to learn these skills, and really people of all ages. However, with all of that said, a large proportion of people here cannot afford to spend more on food, as we've said, and most people don't have access to land to grow it on. So for myself and most people I know, buying a predominantly organic diet just wouldn't be possible while paying the other costs associated with their lives, like rent or bills. And obviously a lot of people live in emergency accommodation or direct provision who don't have access to cooking facilities often, not to mind organic food. So this is why we need to understand the issue as political as food injustice. We live in a society where some have access to all they need while others live in poverty and must rely on inexpensive processed foods to survive. Some people call this kind of unequal access and distribution food deserts, but Leah Penniman, who's a Black farmer in the US, who runs a CSA called Soul Fire Farm, she calls this system food apartheid because she points out it's a man-made issue. It's not something that naturally occurs. Capitalism and food apartheid is what allows us to live in a society where, for example, a corporation like Aramark can own the company Avoca with its luxury food products for those who live in food abundance, while also operating direct provision centres where residents have to survive on inadequate, cheap processed food which doesn't fulfill their nutritional needs and leaves them hungry while having no access to cooking facilities, while also working in private prisons in the United States where inmates have had to protest after finding glass and maggots in their food and being underfed. So just looking at one company can show us how clearly under capitalism some people are valued and others are not. Who gets to eat what, who does the difficult work in the food system, and who owns the land are all food justice issues. So to finish, food is one of our most basic needs, and it should be an immense source of joy in our lives. We cannot allow this reality to continue, whereby so many are denied access to nutritious food, land to grow it on, and connection to nature. We need to change the farming system from one where commodities are grown to sell in global markets to one where we use ecological and regenerative practices to grow healthy food to nourish people. In a few weeks, we'll have another webinar on food justice, and we'll be hearing from folks like those in Cooking for Freedom to find out some ways in which we can join together to struggle for a better food future. Under capitalism, we're encouraged to disengage from the food system and to ignore how our food arrives on our plates. But we really have to resist that and collectively re-entangle ourselves in the food and farming web and in the living world with a radical ethic of care and love. So just to let people know, our next webinar next week, it's really great. It's going to be so interesting. It's going to include voices from the front lines of environmental resistance struggles. This will take in communities locally and globally that are resisting the exploitation and destruction of the planet. This resistance takes many forms, including blocking extractive projects, land and resource grabbing, challenging environmental racism, colonialism, classism, and the continuation of business as usual. We're very excited to have a speaker from the Wet'suwet'en Nation, specifically from the Gidimt'en clan joining us. And before I go, I want to share a call for solidarity with them. So July 11th marks the 30th anniversary of Oka, which was when the military of the Canadian government attacked unceded Indigenous Mohawk land in order to clear the way for development. Today, Indigenous communities across Canada and across the globe are still fighting to defend their lands from resource-devouring capitalists and the governments that attempt to subdue any resistance to their interests. The Wet'suwet'en continue to fight for their land against encroachments by big oil and their pipelines, and the RCMP, which are the federal police, who are there to harass, intimidate, and arrest anyone who gets in the way of industry. So the land is unceded, and it's been inhabited by the Wet'suwet'en for thousands of years before Canada even existed. They have never consented to a pipeline being built through their lands, and they continue to struggle against this invasion. So this July 11th, you can stand in solidarity with them and their fight for their sovereignty and for their land. you can, if there's no action near you, which there probably won't be in Ireland, you could plan one, or you could share a post on social media in support of them, and we'll post that call in our channels as well. So yeah, that's for next week. I hope people can join us then, and yeah, thanks again from everyone in Shliela. That was just really, really great. Okay.